Well, hello and welcome to my shop. My name is Dima. So I've always admired the Rubo style workbenches, but because I use my garage as a shop space, I don't really necessarily have a lot of room for me to build one, not to mention the materials to put one together. So what I decided to do is take off the metal wing that's part of my table saw and convert that into kind of a mini workbench with a vise and dog holes that I could clamp stuff in. Now I was able to construct this out of maple. I was able to laminate a bunch of maple strips together to make it 2¼ inches thick, 14 inches wide, and 30 inches long. Now as you can see, I was able to get 8 dog holes in my workbench, and they're spaced about 3 inches apart, and then I put my 9th dog hole in my actual vise, something I could clamp my work pieces in and then sand if I wanted to. And that's on there pretty strong. So I'll show you how I made it. So I started off by measuring how much material I'm gonna need and then going to my lumber rack to pick out the maple that I needed. So after figuring out how many pieces I'm gonna need, I would need 6 boards out of these 2 slabs of maple. And I cut them to about 29 inches long, which will give me enough material on both ends so I can square the ends and still have enough length for the slab. So now that I got my 6 boards cut, the next thing to do is get them all square and get ready for gluing. Since the boards are rough cut lumber and they're kind of cupped and warped, I had to run them through my planer to get them all flat. To do this, I'm using my planer sled so I could shim the high spots, stabilize the piece, and then run it through my planer to get one flat face. So now that I got all the 6 boards with the one flat face, I went ahead and ran them through the planer without the sled to flatten the opposite side. So once I had 2 perfectly parallel faces, I went ahead and cut the 2½ inch strips. I cut them 2½ because that'll give me 1/4 inch off of each face to run them through the joiner and the planer to get the faces completely flat. So now that I got all my strips cut, I came up with a total of 12 strips that were 2½ inches wide, 1 1/8 thick, and 29 inches long. So now I lined up all the strips for gluing. I made sure that the edge that's going to show, the good edge, is going to be on the show face, and I went ahead and applied glue. Now this is the point where I realized that good clamps is a good thing to have. This is also a good time to make sure that your glue coverage is pretty even and consistent and you've got enough glue on there. You don't want any dry spots. Before I clamp them down, I do make sure that the pieces are somewhat lined up and square, so that way I won't have to take too much material off at the end. And here I'm just adding some extra clamps on the ends to make sure that my boards stay lined up and don't kind of get out of whack when I'm clamping them down. So now that the glue has dried for about 24 hours, I go ahead and remove it from the clamps. So the next thing you want to do is you want to flatten one face. Now, I had to go to my good friend Matthew Carmona's shop because he has a really nice 12-inch joiner that I could just run it through a couple times and I won't have to do any kind of setup. Now if you don't have a 12-inch joiner or anyone that has one, what you could do is you could use a sled with some shims to shim the high spots and just run it through your planer. So now making sure that I got one flat straight edge, the next thing I do is just run it through the planer. And all the planer does is make sure that the thickness of the board is consistent throughout and there's really no high spots. And I just keep running it through until all the board edges are completely flat. So now I square one edge and then flip the board over and trim the other side to make the board exactly 11.5 inches wide. Now you don't have to use the same measurement. I decided to just copy the existing wing that I removed from my table saw. So now using my table saw sled, I go ahead and trim one end square and then I flip the board over and cut it to length, which is going to be 29 inches long. The table is going to end up a little bit longer because I am going to add the vise jaw. So the next thing I do is remove the existing wing so I could start measuring up the hardware to mount to the table saw and the table. By removing a couple of nuts and bolts, the table saw wing comes off with ease. So now I'm just laying the angle iron aluminum to the slab and just marking off where I'm going to cut it. So the next thing I have to do is cut a rabbet recess. I wanted a positive stop for that angle iron to butt up against. This angle iron is what's going to be used to mount the table to the table saw. So now I just make sure that I'm happy with how the angle iron is going to sit in that rabbet, and I move on to the next step. So the next thing I do is I drill all the dog holes using a 3/4 inch Forstner bit. I think I'm gonna skip through this clip just because you don't want to see me drilling all 8 holes. Well, this pretty much completes part 1 of the table saw workbench build. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the first part. If you did, let me know by giving me a thumbs up, comment down below if you got any additional questions of what happened in the video, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so right here. Well, have fun in the shop, be safe doing it, see you next time. Enjoyable to watch.
You know it's gonna make it in the shop, right?